The rusted safe had not opened in 11 years, and in 11 years, the town of Caldwell Creek had never needed it to open more desperately than it did on that sweltering Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1883. Margaret Ramsey was on her knees in the dirt in front of the sheriff's office, her fine muslin skirts pooling around her, her fingers coated in a mixture of substances that no woman in Caldwell Creek had ever combined before: turpentine, vinegar, and a precise ratio of oil of vitriol, so diluted it would not burn but would work like a whisper against iron oxide. She worked with the focus of a surgeon, the calm of a woman who had calculated every variable before she ever touched that lock. Around her, 23 townspeople watched in complete silence, the kind of silence that follows catastrophe when there is nothing left to do but witness. Oliver Archer stood 6 feet and 2 inches of sun-darkened muscle and controlled fury directly behind her, his jaw locked so tight the muscle in his cheek twitched. He had already tried the lock twice with the combined force of himself and 2 other men and a crowbar. He had tried drilling it. He had watched the blacksmith try and fail for 40 minutes. And now he was watching a seamstress work a formula onto a rusted lock with a small horsehair brush, and every instinct in his body told him this was impossible, that she could not possibly succeed where iron and brute strength had failed. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Inside that safe were the signed property deeds for every landholder in Caldwell Creek, the town's operating funds, $4,000 in gold and paper, and a document that, if not produced before the circuit judge arrived on Thursday morning, would result in the forced transfer of 80% of the town's land to a railroad syndicate that had been working a dark and elaborate trap for 3 years. The town's survival lived inside 2 inches of rusted steel. Margaret applied the 3rd coat of her formula with steady hands, set down her brush on the clean cloth she had laid beside her, and said quietly, to nobody in particular, "Give it 4 minutes." Oliver Archer exhaled through his nose. He was a man who did not believe in waiting when there was action available, but something about the absolute certainty in her voice stopped him from saying anything at all. That certainty was the first thing that had ever surprised him about Margaret Ramsey. It would not be the last. She had come to Caldwell Creek 14 months before this moment, arriving on the afternoon stage in April of 1882 with 2 large trunks, a sewing machine crated separately, and a reputation that preceded her from Santa Fe, where she had worked for 3 years as a seamstress, and as the letter from her former employer stated simply and with great understatement, an individual of uncommon practical intelligence. Caldwell Creek was a town of about 400 souls on the Kansas plains, a cattle town that had known boom and was now navigating something closer to fragile stability. It had 2 saloons, a general store, a church still missing its steeple, a hotel called the Meridian that served reasonable food, a livery, a blacksmith, and until Margaret arrived, no dedicated seamstress. Women had been sewing their own clothes and those of their families for years, and the arrival of a professional was met with both relief and curiosity. Margaret was 26 when she came to Caldwell Creek. She was medium height with brown hair, she kept pinned severely back when she worked, brown eyes that could read a room in seconds, and hands that were simultaneously the most capable and most expressive part of her face. She was not the most beautiful woman in town in the traditional sense that men tended to discuss, but she had a quality of self-possession that made people look twice and then keep looking, trying to understand what exactly it was about her that made the air feel slightly different when she entered a room. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a pharmacist, and this was the secret that most people in Caldwell Creek would not learn for months. Her father, a precise and scholarly man named Arthur Ramsey, had raised her in his shop after her mother died when Margaret was 7. He had no son, and he had never particularly wished for one. He had simply taught Margaret everything he knew, which was considerable, and she had absorbed it with an appetite that eventually surpassed him. By 12, she could compound most of his standard preparations from memory. By 15, she understood the chemical properties of the ingredients more completely than he did, and had begun writing letters to a professor at Washington University, asking questions that the professor, intrigued, answered at length. She had come west not out of desperation, but out of deliberate choice. St. Louis had felt to her like a city that wanted to put her in boxes she did not fit. The frontier, for all its roughness, offered something she valued more than comfort, the freedom to be exactly what she was without apology. She opened her shop in a narrow storefront between the general store and the post office, painted the sign herself, RAMSEY, Seamstress and Alterations, and within 3 weeks had more work than she could manage alone. She hired a local girl named Clara to assist with the simpler work. She kept her pharmacy knowledge to herself, initially, as a private resource she used for personal needs and quiet assistance when asked. Oliver Archer did not come to her shop for 3 months after she arrived, which was unusual because Oliver Archer was the kind of man who noticed things quickly and generally acted on them. He was 32, the owner of the Arrow Ranch 5 miles east of town, a cattle operation he had built from nothing after arriving in Caldwell Creek 8 years earlier with $40, a good horse, and a stubbornness that the landscape seemed to respect. He had dark hair, gray eyes that were sharp and direct, and a physical presence that filled a doorframe without effort. He was not a cruel man, but he was an exacting one. He had high standards for everything he allowed into his life, including people, and those standards had kept him largely solitary in matters of the heart, despite the fact that several women in Caldwell Creek had made their interest plain. He was, when he finally entered Margaret's shop in July, there on entirely practical business. He needed 2 shirts altered, a vest repaired, and a work jacket where the sleeve was coming away at the shoulder. He brought them in a bundle, set them on her counter, stated his needs with the brevity of a man who considered small talk a mild waste of time, and then paused because she had responded to his list of requests not by nodding agreeably, but by asking him a series of specific, precise questions about his range of motion during different types of work, which way he tended to carry his weight when riding, and whether he ran warm or cool, because it would affect the weight of the replacement thread she selected for the jacket. He stood there for a moment and processed the fact that he was being assessed more carefully than he assessed most of his cattle. "You ask a lot of questions for a seamstress," he said, not unkindly, observationally. "You'd be surprised what can go wrong with a jacket when you don't ask the right ones," she replied, already making notes. He picked up his hat, which he had removed automatically when he entered. "Arrow Ranch, I'll be back Thursday." "I know who you are, Mr. Archer," she said without looking up. "Your reputation arrived before you did." He stopped at the door. "Is that so? What kind of reputation?" She looked up then. "The kind that suggests you work hard, expect the same from others, and don't much care for complications." She gave him a look that was entirely neutral but somehow communicated everything. "I'll have your shirts ready Thursday. The jacket will take until Saturday. The shoulder seam needs to be reset from the source, not just at the tier. Whoever did it the first time didn't account for the way you carry." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Miss Ramsey." She was already back at her work. "Good afternoon, Mr. Archer." He thought about that conversation for 3 days, which was at least 2 days and 23 hours longer than he generally spent thinking about conversations. He came back Thursday for the shirts, Saturday for the jacket, and the jacket fit perfectly better than it had when he had bought it new, because she had made a structural correction he had not even asked for, solving a problem he had not known he was having. He put it on in the shop and shrugged his shoulders experimentally and felt the ease of the fit like something settling into its right place. "How did you know?" he asked. "The wear pattern on your original seam told me where you were compensating," she said. "It was not difficult to read once you knew what to look for." He paid her. He tipped his hat. He left. He came back the following Tuesday with no clothing to repair and no stated reason, and stood in her doorway for just long enough to seem slightly less certain of himself than usual, which was noticeable because Oliver Archer uncertain was a rare and interesting sight, before he asked if she would like to have supper at the Meridian on Friday evening. Margaret looked at him over the top of her spectacles. She wore them for close work, a detail that he found, inexplicably, deeply compelling, and said, "I'll need to know by Thursday whether you're asking to be polite or because you actually want to." "I actually want to," he said, without hesitation. "Friday, then," she said. 7 o'clock. He was there at 5 minutes to 7, which she noted and respected. Supper at the Meridian was an education for both of them. Oliver Archer had been raised on a farm in Tennessee before moving west at 24 after a series of events he was not yet ready to discuss with anyone, and he had the kind of practical intelligence that the frontier demanded and rewarded, but had never encountered anyone who combined it with the theoretical rigor that Margaret moved through naturally. She, for her part, had spent years in conversations that either talked down to her or talked past her, and the experience of sitting across from a man who listened with complete attention and pushed back on her ideas with genuine substance, rather than dismissal, was so unusual it felt almost disorienting. They talked for 2 hours and were asked, gently, by the hotel proprietor's wife if they intended to order dessert or had simply claimed the table for the evening. Oliver laughed a real laugh, the kind that surprised even him, and ordered the apple pie. She ordered the same, and when it came she took one bite and said, "There's cardamom in here that wasn't here last week. I wonder if Mrs. Chen got a new shipment in." Oliver stared at her. "You can taste cardamom." "I can taste most things with some precision," she said, as if this were entirely ordinary. "My father was a pharmacist. You spend enough time working with ingredients and you develop a fairly specific palate." He set down his fork. "Your father was a pharmacist." "In St. Louis, yes. He passed 2 years ago." She said it cleanly, without excessive grief, the way people say things they have already processed. "He taught me his trade. I do not practice it professionally, but the knowledge does not disappear." Oliver was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight of the Meridian dining room with an expression that was not quite any of the things she had seen on men's faces before, not admiration exactly, not curiosity exactly, but something that was both and also something else underneath, something she did not have a name for yet. "What made you come west?" he asked. "I wanted to be somewhere where what I could do mattered more than what I was supposed to be," she said. "And you?" He picked his fork back up. "That is a longer story. We have a while yet," she said. "Mrs. Chen is not going to rush us out." So he told her, slowly, in pieces, the way he had never told anyone in Caldwell Creek, that he had come from a family in Tennessee that had held considerable land before the war and lost it afterward, not to battle, but to bad debts and worse decisions made by his father in the years of Reconstruction. That he had worked as a ranch hand in Texas for 4 years, then Oklahoma for 2, learning everything there was to know about cattle and range management, and what made the difference between an operation that survived and one that didn't. That he had ridden into Caldwell Creek on a November morning in 1874, liked the look of the land east of town, and decided with no particular fanfare to make it his. "And it worked," she said. "It is working," he corrected. "It is always in the process of working. The day you decide it has worked is the day something comes along to remind you it hasn't." She looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "You are more philosophical than your reputation suggested." "My reputation and I are not always in complete agreement," he said. She smiled at that, not the polite smile she gave customers, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes and stayed there. And Oliver Archer, who had ridden into a dozen dangerous situations in his life with his heart beating completely steady, felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately have words for. They walked back toward her shop after supper, the summer night warm and full of crickets and distant cattle sounds, and he walked with her to her door and stood in the street light. Caldwell Creek had 2 gas lamps on Main Street, recently installed, and thanked her for the evening. "Thank me," she said, her hand on her door, by asking again. "Same time next week." "I'll be here," she said, and went inside. He stood in the street for a moment before walking to his horse. A man walking past, one of his ranch hands, a young fellow named Pete Dolly, looked at him curiously and said, "Evening, Mr. Archer. You all right?" "Fine," said Oliver Archer, and rode home to his ranch and sat on his porch for an hour looking at the stars and thinking about a woman who could taste cardamom. Through the rest of the summer and into the fall of 1882, Oliver and Margaret moved toward each other the way two people move who have both been alone long enough to be careful about it, deliberately, with their eyes open, testing the ground before they put their full weight on it. He took her to supper every Friday. She came to the ranch twice to see it, and asked questions about the operation that were so specific and so practically intelligent that his foreman, an older man named Hector Vasquez, who had been with Oliver for 5 years and had seen a dozen women come and go from Oliver's orbit, pulled him aside after the second visit and said simply, "That one's different, boss." Oliver said, "I know," and Hector nodded and went back to work. She told him about her chemistry, slowly, in the way she told everything, in pieces that revealed themselves as part of a larger whole only when you had collected enough of them. She showed him her small private collection of materials she kept in a locked cabinet at the back of her shop, the various compounds her father had taught her, the additions she had made to her own knowledge through years of reading and correspondence. She explained what each was for, what it could do and what it could not do, where its limits were. He listened to all of it with the same absolute attention he gave everything that mattered to him. "You could have been a doctor," he said once, looking at the cabinet. "I could have been many things," she said. "I chose to be what I am." "Which is?" She considered this seriously, as she considered everything. "A very good seamstress who happens to have extensive secondary knowledge." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. "That is a considerable understatement." "Most accurate things are," she said, and locked the cabinet. In October, he kissed her for the first time. It was not planned, or rather, it was the kind of thing that both parties are aware is approaching but have agreed without words to let arrive on its own terms rather than orchestrate it. They had been walking back from the church social. She attended because the minister's wife was a customer and valued the gesture. He attended because Margaret was going, and had taken a longer route back through the edge of town, where the cottonwood trees grew thick along the creek bank, and the moonlight was doing something specific and unrepeatable to the water, and he had stopped walking, and so had she, and he had looked at her for a moment in the way he had been looking at her for months, with that expression she still didn't quite have the name for, and then he had kissed her, once, carefully, and she had kissed him back, with equal care and somewhat more certainty. "I have been wanting to do that since July," he said when they had stopped. "I know," she said. "I thought you were going to do it 3 weeks ago and then you didn't." He made a sound that was a surprised laugh. "What stopped me? You seemed to be thinking about something. I didn't interrupt." He shook his head slowly. "You are the most unusual woman I have ever met." "Is that a complaint?" "It is the furthest possible thing from one," he said, and offered her his arm to walk back. She took it, and they walked back through the moonlit town, and two people who had both spent considerable time being entirely alone began to seriously consider the possibility of not being. The fall deepened. He told her the rest of his history, not just the land in Tennessee, but the fiancée he had left behind there, a girl named Louise who had married another man within 6 months, which had hurt less than he expected, which had told him something about the relationship he had not been willing to face while he was in it. She told him about her years in Santa Fe, the other women she had met there who were navigating the same tension she navigated, capable women in a world that was not always willing to accommodate that capability. She told him about the professor at Washington University who had died the previous year, whose death had felt like losing a second intellectual parent. He told her about the Arrow Ranch's precarious early years, the bad winter of 1878 that had killed a third of his herd, the loan he had taken from a bank in Wichita, and paid back with interest in under 2 years through sheer ferocity of effort. She listened to all of it and asked questions that were never intrusive but were always exactly right. By December, they had settled into something that both of them recognized, though neither had said it outright, as the beginning of a permanent arrangement. He was at her shop 3 evenings a week. She rode out to the Arrow Ranch on Sunday mornings and ate breakfast with him and Hector and the 3 other hands who lived on the property. She had mended every jacket and shirt on the ranch by November and had declined payment for all of it, which Oliver had objected to strongly, and she had overruled with a logic so clean he had nothing left to argue with. It was December when the trouble began to show itself, though it had been building for longer than any of them knew. The railroad was coming to Caldwell Creek. This was, on its surface, good news. It meant growth. It meant commerce. It meant the town would not gradually dwindle into the kind of half-abandoned settlement that dotted the plains like old scars. But the railroad was not coming out of civic generosity. It was coming under the direction of a land syndicate based in Kansas City. The name on the formal documents was Western Consolidated Transport and Land Development, though the people of Caldwell Creek came to call it by shorter and less printable names, and the syndicate had a hidden motive that was slowly becoming less hidden. Western Consolidated wanted the land that the railroad would make valuable. They wanted it before the railroad made it valuable, which meant they needed to acquire it at pre-railroad prices through means that were not always straightforward. Their man in Caldwell Creek was a lawyer named Victor Haas, a polished, soft-spoken man in his 40s who had arrived in October and opened an office and smiled at everyone and bought drinks at the saloon, and was, in Margaret's assessment the first time she met him, exactly the kind of man you needed to watch very carefully precisely, because he seemed so very easy to trust. She told Oliver this on a Sunday morning in December over coffee and eggs at the Arrow Ranch, and he looked at her over his coffee cup and said, "What is it about him specifically?" "He asks questions that are shaped like conversation but are actually information gathering," she said. "And he listens to the answers with too much of his face. People who are genuinely interested listen with their attention. People who are working listen with their expression." Oliver was quiet, turning this over. "Then I'll have Hector keep his ears open at the saloon." "Already asked him," she said. He set his coffee cup down. "You asked Hector?" "On my way in this morning. He is discreet and he is observant. I thought the combination useful." She met his eyes steadily. "I hope that was not overstepping." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through something, and she braced herself slightly for the kind of response she had encountered from men before, the gentle but firm assertion of territory, the reminder that certain things were his to manage. It did not come. What came instead was something that looked a great deal like relief. "No," he said. "It was not overstepping." She nodded and refilled his coffee, and they talked about the lawyer and the railroad and the dark possibility that was beginning to take shape, and worked through what they knew and what they did not know with the same methodical attention they gave every problem. What Hector learned over the next few weeks at the saloon was troubling. Western Consolidated was making quiet overtures to several property owners in and around Caldwell Creek, offering prices that seemed fair on the surface, but were structured with conditions. A delayed payment schedule, a legal clause about access and usage rights, that effectively transferred control of the land while leaving the original owner with a piece of paper that looked like ownership, but functioned like nothing of the sort. 3 property owners had already signed documents before anyone understood what they were signing. All 3 were older men who did not read particularly well, and had trusted that a document from a Kansas City legal firm was what it said it was. Margaret read one of the documents persuaded from one of the affected owners, a cattle man named Gus Welliver, who came to her in January with what he called a bad feeling that he could not locate the source of, and sat with it for an hour at her work table before explaining, in plain language, exactly what Gus had signed and what it meant. Gus Welliver went gray in the face, then red. "Can it be undone?" he asked. "A circuit court judge could void it if we can demonstrate the terms were misrepresented at the time of signing," she said. "That requires a formal legal challenge, and it requires the town to produce evidence of a pattern of deception, which means finding all the affected owners and documenting the misrepresentations." She folded the document carefully and returned it to him. "It also requires someone to formally represent the town's interest before a judge, because Victor Haas will have considerable resources behind him and will not accept a challenge without a fight." Oliver, when she told him, was already reaching for his coat. She put a hand on his arm. "There is more," she said. He stopped. "Property deeds, all of them, the originals that the county clerk filed when Caldwell Creek was incorporated in 1871, are in the town safe at the sheriff's office. Those documents establish prior claim for every landowner in town. If Western Consolidated can dispute the validity of any of the current property claims, those original deeds are the evidence that settles it. Without them, the challenge becomes significantly more complicated." Oliver looked at her. "So the safe matters." "The safe matters enormously," she said. "And the circuit judge, Judge Harlan Prentice, out of Wichita, will be in town in approximately 3 months for the spring session. That is our window." "What do we do?" he asked. She had a list already. It was on her work table, written in her precise hand. He looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment that was more intimate than anything that had come before it, the recognition of two people standing on the same side of the same battle, choosing it together. "We start tomorrow," he said. "I started this morning," she said. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard work of a particular kind, not physical, or not only physical, but the grinding, invisible work of building a case. Margaret organized the affected property owners, all 7 of them ultimately, into a group that met at the back of her shop on Tuesday evenings. She helped them understand their documents, explained the legal language, drafted letters of complaint to the state land office in Topeka. Oliver rode to 3 neighboring towns to speak with their sheriffs and land officers about whether Western Consolidated had been active in their counties as well. It had in 2 of them, with similar results. The town sheriff, a decent man named Walt Pruitt, who was better with a gun than with documents, was grateful for their assistance and said so plainly and more than once. He was also the one to mention in late January that the town safe had been showing signs of increasing rust for several years and that the lock had become difficult to turn. "How difficult?" Margaret asked. "Well, I haven't opened it since last spring," Walt said, looking slightly embarrassed. "But it was stiff then." Margaret and Oliver exchanged a look. "We should open it and check the contents," Oliver said. Walt tried the lock the following morning with Oliver present. It did not move. A full hour of effort with increasing force, including 3 other men brought in to assist, produced nothing. The safe, a Diebold model installed when the town was founded in 1871, had been in a corner of the sheriff's office against an exterior wall that was imperfectly sealed against weather, and 12 Kansas winters and summers had done their slow and comprehensive work. The lock was rusted completely shut. Margaret was sent for. She came, assessed the situation, the safe, the lock, the degree of rust, the construction of the lock mechanism, the material composition of the safe itself, with the focused attention she brought to everything. She asked Walt 3 questions about the safe's history. She ran her fingernail along the edge of the lock housing and examined what came away. She stood back with her arms folded and thought for 60 seconds. "I can open it," she said. Every man in the room turned to look at her. "The lock is a lever tumbler mechanism," she said, completely calm. "The rust has seized the tumblers, but the mechanism itself is not broken. It is a chemical problem, not a structural one. I need to dissolve enough of the oxidation to allow the tumblers to move without disturbing the underlying steel." She looked at Oliver specifically, because he was the one whose face was asking the clearest question. "I will need to compound a formula. I have most of what I need at the shop. I will need oil of vitriol, which I'll have to obtain from the pharmacy in Dodge City. There's a stage that goes Thursday, and I can send a written order." "How long?" Walt asked. 10 days for the materials to arrive, assuming no delays. Another day to prepare the formula. Then application time, I would estimate a minimum of 3 applications over 2 days to work the rust sufficiently. She looked at the safe. "Call it 2 weeks from today." Sheriff Prout had the safe moved by Thursday to a position away from the exterior wall. Margaret's order went out on the Thursday stage. She spent her evenings over the next week continuing her other work, reviewing documents, meeting with the property owners, and preparing everything else she would need. Oliver, who had been present for most of these events, found himself in a state that he would not have described easily to anyone who asked. He was not a man who was easily unsettled, and the emotion working through him during those weeks was not quite unsettlement. It was something else, something that had to do with watching a woman he was falling in love with operate at the full extent of her capability, and discovering that the extent was very, very large. He had until this point understood himself to be a competent man in a difficult world. He was good at what he did. He made sound decisions. He solved problems. He had built something real from nothing. But Margaret Ramsey's particular quality of intelligence was not like anything he had encountered, and the specific experience of watching it applied to a real problem with real stakes was doing something to him that he could not entirely get in front of. It was not threatening. It was not emasculating. It was something closer to wonder, the feeling of standing in front of something that is larger and more complex than you had understood it to be, and finding that the complexity makes it more magnificent rather than less. He told her this, or tried to, on a Sunday morning in February when they were sitting on the porch of his ranch house in the winter sun, which was pale and thin but present. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it correctly, which means I need a moment to find the words." She looked at him and waited, because Margaret Ramsey was very good at waiting when waiting was the right thing. "I have been watching you," he said. "Work this situation, the lawyer, the documents, the owners, and now the safe. And I think I need to tell you that I have never in my life encountered anyone who does what you do, the way you do it. And I have been aware for some time that I have deep feelings for you, but I want you to understand that those feelings are not separate from what I have just described. They are made of it, at least in part. What you are capable of is not something I want to work around or manage or accommodate. It is one of the primary reasons I—" He stopped because the word he had not yet said aloud was there in the space between them now, and it was large and serious and deserved to be treated as such. "Oliver," she said very quietly. "I love you," he said. "I have been moving toward that for months, and now I am there, and I am not going to manage it or soften it. I love you." The winter sun was on his face, and he was looking at her with those gray eyes completely undefended, and Margaret Ramsey, who had always known exactly what to do with every variable in every situation, sat for a moment with her hands still in her lap and felt something open in her chest like a door she had kept bolted against a wind she had been afraid to let in. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time. I was waiting to be sure you were ready to hear it." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that in the pale February sun, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was fine because everything necessary had been said. That evening, he asked her to marry him. Not dramatically, not on one knee, but directly and with complete sincerity, sitting at his kitchen table over coffee after supper, because that was how Oliver Archer did things of real importance, without theater, with absolute intention. She said yes, also without theater, with a quietness that contained everything. The oil of vitriol arrived on the Wednesday stage, and Margaret spent the following day preparing her formula with the same meticulous care she gave every important task. The turpentine and vinegar were from her own supply. She diluted the oil of vitriol to a very specific concentration, low enough to be safe for the steel lock housing, high enough to work effectively on the rust, and added a small quantity of lampblack to help her track where the formula had penetrated. She tested the mixture on a piece of rusted iron she had asked the blacksmith for, observed the results over 12 hours, made one adjustment to the dilution, and declared herself ready. The morning of the first application was a Monday. Oliver came with her, along with Sheriff Prout, and inevitably, most of the town who had heard something was going to happen with the safe. Margaret laid her clean cloth on the ground in front of the safe. She arranged her materials, the formula in a small glass bottle, the horsehair brush she used for fine work, a second cloth for blotting, a small tool for working the formula into the lock keyhole itself. She explained, for the benefit of those gathered, what she was doing and why, because she saw no reason to be mysterious about it and several reasons to be transparent. "The lock mechanism has 5 levers," she said, in a clear voice. "The rust has bound them so they cannot move in response to the key. I am going to apply a formula that will dissolve enough of the oxidation to free the levers while leaving the steel itself intact. This process cannot be rushed. The chemistry needs time to work. I will apply the formula this morning, let it work until afternoon, apply a second coat, and repeat tomorrow. By tomorrow afternoon, I expect the lock to be operable." Oliver stood behind her and watched, and the crowd watched, and Victor Haas, who had appeared at the edge of the gathering with the careful neutrality of a man monitoring a situation that might go against him, watched most carefully of all. Margaret worked. She applied the formula with precise, methodical strokes, working it into every point of the lock mechanism that she could reach. She inserted a thin tool into the keyhole and worked the formula in along the tumbler path. She was unhurried and completely focused, and the focus radiated off her in a way that kept even the most restless members of the crowd still. When she had finished the first application, she stood up, cleaned her brush, and said, "We let it work. Come back at 2." Oliver offered her his hand to rise. She took it, and he held it a beat longer than the assistance required, and she did not pull away. At 2 in the afternoon, she applied the second coat. The crowd was smaller but still significant. She noted that the rust along the upper edge of the lock was already beginning to show a slight change in texture. It was the formula working, breaking the oxidation bonds at the molecular level. She said nothing about this to the crowd because it would not have meant much to most of them, but she caught Oliver's eye and gave him a small nod that said, "It is working." He gave her the same nod back. The shorthand of 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other for months. She applied a third coat that evening by lamplight, alone except for Oliver, who had stayed. He held the lamp for her while she worked, standing close, and she was aware of his nearness in the particular way you become aware of the presence of someone you love when you are doing something difficult, as a warmth that does not distract but sustains. "How confident are you?" he asked quietly while she worked. 85%, she said. "The rust is responding correctly. There is one tumbler I cannot get the formula to fully reach from this angle, and it may need a slightly different approach tomorrow." She blotted and applied and considered. 90% if the overnight penetration goes as I expect. He was quiet for a moment. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then I need to think of something else," she said. "But it will work." She said it the way she said everything she was certain of, without performance or bluster, as a simple statement of assessed reality. And Oliver, holding the lamp, believed her completely. He rode her back to town and saw her to her door, and kissed her good night in the lamplight of Main Street with the particular thoroughness of a man who has decided he is not interested in being careful anymore. And she kissed him back with equal intention, and they said good night. The following morning, Tuesday, was the morning that the crowd gathered for the final application, and the morning that Margaret was on her knees in the dirt in front of the sheriff's office with her formula and her brush, and the morning that Oliver stood behind her with his jaw locked and his heart doing something complicated while she said, "Give it 4 minutes," with the absolute certainty of a woman who has calculated every variable. 4 minutes. In the summer heat of 1883, with the circuit judge arriving in 2 days and Victor Haas at the edge of the crowd, and the survival of 400 people's land tied to 2 inches of rusted steel. The crowd was entirely silent. Somewhere down Main Street a horse blew through its nose. A child held by its mother made a small sound and was hushed. Margaret waited. She did not count under her breath. She watched the lock with complete attention, reading it the way she read everything with patience and precision. Oliver could see from where he stood the slight change in the rust along the lock face. It was almost imperceptible, but he had been watching this process for 2 days and he could see that something had altered. The surface of the rust was different, less solid, more like a thing that could be moved. Margaret said, "Mr. Prout." The sheriff stepped forward with the key he had retrieved from the locked box in his desk, the original key to the safe, which he had not tried to insert in over a year because the lock had been too stiff even for the key. He knelt beside her and inserted the key slowly, carefully, with the sensitivity of a man handling something important, and Margaret watched and said, "Steady pressure. Do not force it. Let the mechanism do the work." Walt Prout turned the key with deliberate, steady pressure. There was a sound, a soft, grating, organic sound, and then a sequence of small metallic clicks as the tumblers, freed of enough oxidation to move, aligned themselves with the key. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th, and the lock opened. The crowd made a sound that was not quite a shout and not quite a collective exhale, but was something between them, a release of pressure that had been building for 2 days and, in some sense, for the months before it. Walt Prout said something that was not suitable for a family gathering and then apologized to the minister's wife. Children cheered without fully understanding why. Oliver Archer stood very still. He had known, on some level, that she would do it. He had believed her when she said it would work, because he had learned over months that her certainty was a calibrated thing and not an empty thing. But knowing it and seeing it were not the same experience, and what he felt standing in that dirt street in the summer morning heat, watching that lock turn, was something that bypassed his intellect entirely and went straight to a place in his chest that he could not have described to anyone and would not have tried. She stood, clean cloth in hand, and looked at the open safe. Then she turned and found his face in the crowd. As she always did, she always knew where he was. It was something they had both observed and neither commented on. And she looked at him with her steady brown eyes, and she allowed herself the smallest, most private smile. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and took her face in his hands and kissed her in front of the entire town of Caldwell Creek, which produced a second round of sounds from the crowd, these ones markedly more entertained. She laughed when he stopped, which was rare and precious. "The documents," she reminded him. "Right," he said, and did not let go of her hand. The documents in the safe were intact, all of them. The original deeds, the town incorporation papers, the county land records from 1871 onward. Margaret spent the afternoon cataloging them with the careful attention of someone who understood what she was handling. Oliver sat across the table from her in the sheriff's office and handed her documents when she asked for them and made notes in the ledger she had brought. Victor Haas, who had been quiet since the safe opened, was not seen at his office that afternoon. A man who had been watching his operation begin to unravel had the look of someone calculating exits. 2 days later, Judge Harlan Prentice arrived on the Thursday stage, a compact man in his 50s with wire spectacles and the specific weariness of someone who had heard every possible variety of human dispute. He set up his court in the meeting room of the Meridian because the town did not yet have a proper courthouse. The proceeding against Western consolidated, and Victor Haas lasted 3 days. Oliver testified about the overtures Haas had made to range land owners east of town. Hector Vasquez testified about conversations he had heard at the saloon. Gus Welliver and the 6 other affected property owners testified about the documents they had signed and what they had been told versus what the documents actually contained. And Margaret Ramsey presented the original deeds from the safe. presented the copies she had made of the affected documents over the winter, and presented a written analysis clear, precise, organized of the specific legal misrepresentations in each of Western Consolidated's agreements, cross-referenced with the actual terms, and cited against Kansas property law, which she had obtained from the state land office in Topeka during her correspondence campaign. Judge Prentice read Margaret's analysis in its entirety before the session opened on the second day, and when he finished, he removed his wire spectacles and polished them and put them back on and looked at her over them. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "are you an attorney?" "No, Your Honor," she said, "I am a seamstress." He looked at her for a moment. "Remarkable," he said, and returned his spectacles to his papers. "The judgment came on Saturday morning. Western Consolidated's land acquisition agreements were declared void on the grounds of material misrepresentation. The 7 affected property owners were restored to full, unencumbered title. Victor Haas was ordered to appear before the district court in Wichita on charges related to fraudulent contract practices, and the marshal who had accompanied Judge Prentice to Caldwell Creek escorted him onto the Saturday stage for that purpose. The town held a celebration that evening in the street outside the Meridian, not a formal thing, just the spontaneous gathering of people who had been under pressure for months and felt it release all at once. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone brought whiskey. The minister's wife brought a remarkable quantity of pie and was thanked at length. Oliver and Margaret stood at the edge of it, close enough to be part of it without being swallowed by it, and watched the town they had both chosen breathe freely again. "It was your work that won it," Oliver said. "It was everyone's work," she said. "It was yours that made everyone else's work matter," he said. He looked at her. "I want you to know that I understand that. I want you to always know that I see it." She turned to look at him. There were lanterns strung along the street and music playing and the sounds of a town celebrating, and in the middle of all of it Margaret Ramsey looked at Oliver Archer and felt the full, specific weight of being known. "I know you do," she said. "That is not nothing, Oliver. That is a very great deal." He took her hand. "When?" She looked at him. "When what?" "When will you marry me?" "You said yes in February and we have not discussed a date." "I was focused on the safe," she said, and now she considered this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "September," she said. "It's a reasonable time of year. The summer heat has broken, the fall work is not yet in full swing, and I will have the fall dress orders finished by August if Clara and I work efficiently." He laughed. "You are planning our wedding around your dress orders." "I am planning our wedding around the practical reality of our lives," she said, "which is how sensible people plan things." He brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles, right there in the street, in front of the whole celebrating town. "September," he said, "I'll hold you to it." "You'll find," she said, "that I don't often need holding to things." The months between February and September were the happiest Oliver Archer had known in his adult life, and he was not a man who said that kind of thing lightly or even particularly often. He said it to Hector one morning in June while they were riding the east fence line, checking posts, and Hector looked at him for a long moment and said, "I know, boss, we can all see it." "Is it obvious?" "From about 40 miles, Hector said, and Oliver shook his head and smiled at the fence posts. Margaret's shop flourished. The events of the spring, the case against Western Consolidated, the opening of the safe had made her something more than a skilled seamstress in the mind of Caldwell Creek. People sought her counsel on matters well outside her stated trade, a dispute about a property boundary, a question about a medical complaint, a man who wanted help writing a formal letter to the state legislature about the condition of the road south of town. She helped where she could and redirected where she couldn't, and gradually, in the way of small towns, she became the person people went to when they had a problem they didn't know how to solve. She continued her correspondence. She had been writing, for years, to a professor of chemistry at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, a woman named Professor Adela Wright, one of the few women holding such a position anywhere in the country, and their exchange deepened in the spring of 1883 as Margaret wrote about the rusted safe and the formula she had applied. Professor Wright's response was enthusiastic and technical and occupied 6 pages, and she asked if Margaret would consider writing up the episode as a formal case study to be shared with her students. Margaret wrote the case study. It was published in a limited academic circular in the fall of 1883. She did not mention it to most people in Caldwell Creek, but she told Oliver, and he read it in its entirety, and when he had finished he said, "Margaret, this should be in a journal." "It is in a circular," she said. "That's more than most things get." "It should be in a real journal," he insisted. "I want Professor Wright to know we think so." She gave him a look that was slightly exasperated and deeply pleased. We, he said firmly. "You are going to marry me in 3 months." "We is appropriate," she wrote to Professor Wright. Professor Wright agreed and submitted it on her behalf to a national scientific journal, where it was published the following year, credited to Margaret Ramsey. It was, to Margaret's knowledge, the first paper on practical electrochemical rust dissolution to be authored by a woman in the American West. She kept the journal issue in the cedar chest she had brought from St. Louis, alongside her father's notes. Oliver found out about this later. She mentioned it in passing, without ceremony, and he stopped what he was doing entirely and made her tell him the full story, which she did with some amusement at his reaction. "You should have told me immediately," he said. "I'm telling you now." Margaret, Oliver. He picked her up off the ground, which was an action she had not expected, and she made a surprised sound that was entirely unlike her usual composure, and he set her back down and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead with a reverence that he usually saved for very large things. "I am extraordinarily proud of you," he said. "I need you to know that." She was quiet for a moment. Her father had said those words to her, and the professor in St. Louis had said them, and no one else in her life had ever said them in a way that felt completely true. Oliver said them in a way that felt completely true. "Thank you," she said, and the simplicity of it contained everything. They were married on a Saturday in September 1883, 3 weeks before the first frost arrived on the Kansas plains. The minister, a patient man named Reverend Cole, performed the ceremony at the church, which had, in a burst of civic energy inspired by the spring's events, finally acquired its steeple in August. The building was full. Nearly everyone in Caldwell Creek attended, plus Hector Vasquez and Pete Dolly and the other Arrow Ranch hands who wore their best clothes and looked collectively somewhat uncomfortable in them. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself, ivory silk with blue embroidery at the cuffs, a construction that represented 3 weeks of work and was the finest thing she had ever sewn. It had a practical, elegant simplicity that was exactly her, and it fit perfectly because she had made it. Oliver, when he saw her at the church door, stood very still for a moment in the way he had stood still the morning. The safe opened, that absolute stillness that was his version of being overwhelmed. And then he offered her his arm and they walked up the aisle together, and Reverend Cole said the words, and they said theirs. The vows they exchanged were the standard ones, but Margaret had quietly asked Reverend Cole about the possibility of adding one line, and he had agreed. And so, after the usual words, she said, in her clear, calm voice, "And I will bring all that I am fully, without reservation, into this life we are building. I will not make myself smaller, and I will not ask you to either." Oliver, who had not known she was going to say this, looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded and said, "I would not want you to, on either count." Reverend Cole, who was a perceptive man, smiled and declared them married. The celebration afterward was considerable. Hector had organized a barbecue at the Arrow Ranch on the scale that suggested he had been planning it for longer than anyone had officially asked him to. Clara, who had worked in Margaret's shop for a year and a half by this point, had baked a wedding cake of ambitious 3-tiered complexity that it took considerable effort not to eat before the ceremony ended. They danced in the ranch yard under lanterns hung from the cottonwood trees, and Oliver danced with more competence than Margaret had expected, and she told him so. "My mother taught me," he said. "She was very insistent that a gentleman danced." "Your mother was right," Margaret said. "She was right about most things," he said. "You would have liked her." "Tell me about her," she said, and they danced through the rest of that song and the next two while he told her about a woman who had been, by his description, fierce and warm and determined, and entirely unwilling to be told what she could not do, and Margaret listened and smiled at the pattern of things. The Arrow Ranch in the years after their marriage expanded steadily, because Oliver was a careful and competent man, and Margaret brought to the operations management a clarity of mind that improved every decision. She did not give up her shop. She and Clara ran it together, and it continued to be the center of a considerable informal operation of council and community that was not visible in any official ledger but was real. Their first child was born in July of 1885, a boy they named Arthur, for her father, a choice that Oliver proposed, and she accepted with a quiet gratitude that she showed him in private and completely. Arthur arrived with a great deal more drama than the naming process, a difficult labor that lasted longer than anyone was comfortable with. But he arrived eventually, loud and emphatically present, and was immediately subjected to the full attention of two parents who had been paying careful attention to things their whole lives. Arthur Archer was, from early on, the kind of child who examined every object he was given before deciding what to do with it, a habit his mother recognized and his father found completely unsurprising. 2 years after Arthur, in the spring of 1887, a second child arrived, a girl they named Alina, who was from the beginning the louder and more impatient of the two, which her father found hilarious and her mother found instructive. The ranch hands, who had watched Oliver Archer transform from a solitary and somewhat impenetrable employer into a man who was visibly, unambiguously happy, were universally of the view that the change was an improvement. Hector, who had been with Oliver the longest and had seen the most of the transformation, said once to Pete Dolly, sitting on the fence of the South Corral watching Oliver teach young Arthur to sit a horse, "You see that right there. That is a man who found the right person." Pete Dolly, who was 22 and beginning to think about such things himself, watched Oliver's steady hands on the horse's bridle while his small son sat very straight in the saddle, and thought that Hector was not wrong. Margaret continued her correspondence with Professor Wright in Lawrence, and in 1888, when the University of Kansas held a symposium on applied chemistry, Margaret was invited to present not as an academic, but as what they called a practitioner of applied scientific methodology in frontier conditions, which was a long way of saying she had solved a real problem in a real place with real results, and that was worth discussing. She went to Lawrence for 4 days in October of 1888. It was the first time she had been more than 30 miles from Caldwell Creek since she had arrived. Oliver drove her to the stage in Dodge City, and they stood on the platform in the early morning, and he looked at her with his gray eyes in the October light and said nothing for a moment. "I'll be back Sunday," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not worried." "You are a little," she said, "but not about me leaving, about something else." He had always been slightly unnerved by how clearly she could read him. "I suppose," he said, "I am aware that you have a world available to you that extends considerably further than Caldwell Creek. And I am aware that I want you to know that if you decide—" "Oliver," she said. "I am trying to say, I know what you are trying to say," she said, "and I am telling you before you say it that the life I want is the one we have, not because I cannot imagine others, but because this one is the one I chose with full knowledge of all the alternatives." She looked at him directly. "You are not a limitation. You understand that, don't you? You are the thing I chose." The stage driver was making noises about departure. She picked up her bag. "Sunday," she said, and kissed him once cleanly and got on the stage. He stood on the platform until the stage was out of sight, and then rode back toward Caldwell Creek thinking about a woman who had just, in 38 seconds, said everything he had needed to hear without him once having to ask for it. The symposium was a success. Margaret presented with the same quiet authority she brought to every other situation, answered questions with precise economy, and spent the evenings in conversation with other women who were navigating similar territories in similar ways: doctors in training, teachers. A botanist from Topeka whose work on native prairie grasses was meticulous and remarkable. She came back to Caldwell Creek on Sunday as promised, with a small package of materials she had found at a Lawrence chemist's shop, and a notebook of ideas, and the particular satisfied look of someone who has been somewhere valuable and is glad to be home. Oliver was on the platform in Dodge City when her stage arrived. Arthur, who was 3½ and had very definite opinions about most things, was balanced on Oliver's shoulders with his hands gripping his father's hat, and a leaner, 18 months, was on Oliver's hip, regarding the arriving stage with the focused attention of someone seeing something new. Margaret got off the stage and looked at her family and felt everything in her settle exactly into place. "You brought the children," she said. "They wanted to come," Oliver said. Or rather, Arthur wanted to come, and Alina had no objection. She took Alina from his hip, and Alina immediately grabbed for her coat button and began an intensive investigation of it. Arthur announced from his position on Oliver's shoulders that he had a report to give about a cow. "A full report," Oliver confirmed, with the expression of a man who had heard this report several times and remained publicly supportive of its continued development. "On the way home," Margaret said, and Oliver grinned at her, and she reached up and touched his face briefly, a small gesture that meant everything, and they walked to the wagon. In 1889, the Kansas plains saw a run of severe weather, a dry summer followed by a hard winter, that tested a great deal of what the ranches and farms around Caldwell Creek had built. The Arrow Ranch came through it better than most, because Oliver had managed his operation with the kind of reserves and contingency planning that looked excessive in good years and essential in bad ones. They helped their neighbors where they could feed, labor. Margaret organized the town's informal relief efforts, as she had organized most things for the past several years, with lists and letters, and a precise understanding of who needed what and how to get it to them. The blacksmith's family had a particular bad stretch, and Margaret quietly arranged for several months' worth of firewood to appear, attributed to the church's charitable fund, because she knew the blacksmith was a proud man, and the fiction of institutional charity would sit better with him than the reality of his neighbor's pity. Oliver, when she told him what she had done, said that she was the most tactically intelligent person he had ever encountered, and that he meant that as the compliment it was. The winter of 1889 broke eventually, the way all winters do, into a spring that was the more welcome for the difficulty that had preceded it. By 1890, Caldwell Creek had grown. The railroad had come at last, a legitimate arrangement, negotiated fairly, with the benefit of a town government that was considerably more informed about contractual language than it had been in 1882. The steeple on the church was no longer the newest structure. There was a proper schoolhouse, a second doctor, a newspaper called the Creek Clarion that printed twice weekly, and a new sheriff who had been elected rather than appointed, and who was generally conceded to be excellent. Margaret's shop had expanded into the adjacent storefront, and she had taken on 2 additional assistants in addition to Clara, because the work had grown beyond what 3 people could manage. She had also, quietly and without fanfare, begun teaching. Not formally, not in the school, though the school teacher, a young man named Daniel Foss, had asked her twice to come speak to his students about applied chemistry, and she had done it, but in her shop in the evenings, she ran what she called informal instruction for women who wanted to understand things. Chemistry, basic legal literacy, the reading of contracts. She charged nothing. It was, said Hector Vasquez once to Oliver, an education. "It is exactly that," Oliver said. "You know what you married," Hector said, which was not quite a question. "I knew when I walked into her shop," Oliver said. "I did not have the full scope of it yet, but I knew enough." Hector nodded. Good thing you were paying attention then. The best thing I ever did, Oliver said. The summer of 1891 brought a third child, another boy whom they named James, for no particular historical reason except that both of them liked the solidity of it. And James Archer was from his first weeks a child of considerable opinion and considerable volume, which Arthur, now 6, found interesting, and Alina, now 4, found slightly objectionable on the grounds that she had been the loud one. James's arrival coincided with a stretch of genuine contentment that Margaret, sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the evenings with Oliver beside her, and the sounds of 3 children either sleeping or theoretically sleeping inside, allowed herself to fully feel. She was not a woman who avoided feeling things. She had simply always been precise about them, clear-eyed about what she felt and why and what to do with it. And what she felt in the summer of 1891, sitting in the golden Kansas evening with Oliver's hand in hers and the ranch around them, and the life they had built together standing in every direction she could see, was a happiness so specific and so real that she could have compounded a formula for it if formulas could hold that kind of thing. Oliver, who had been quiet beside her in the comfortable way they had developed over years of evenings, said, "What are you thinking?" "That I am glad I came west," she said. He looked at her. "What made you think of that?" "I think about it regularly," she said. "I like to know the reasons for good things." He brought her hand up and held it in both of his, which he did sometimes when he was feeling something large. "I am glad you came west," he said, with a degree of conviction that I do not have words adequate to. "You have always managed," she said. "You find the words. When it matters," he said, "you make it matter." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes when precision gave way to something simpler and warmer, and they sat in the evening and watched the sky do what Kansas skies do, paint itself in colors that demanded attention, and then quietly, majestically, give way to stars. Inside, Arthur called out something about a book, and Alina responded with something about whose book it actually was, and James made the general announcement that he was awake. "Thank you very much." And Margaret stood up, and Oliver followed her inside into the warm noise of the house they had made, and the evening closed around the Arrow Ranch like something settled and permanent. 2 years later, in the fall of 1893, something happened that Margaret had been half expecting for some time, and that gave her deep satisfaction when it arrived. She received a formal letter from the Kansas Bar Association Examination Board, not asking her to sit the exam. Women were not yet, in Kansas in 1893, permitted to sit the bar exam, but informing her that on the strength of her documented contributions to legal proceedings, her published academic work, and a petition signed by 4 members of the Wichita legal community, including Judge Harlan Prentice, she had been designated a recognized consultant in property law practice, a designation that had never been given before and was, as the letter acknowledged, an imperfect solution to an imperfect situation. She read the letter twice, folded it, and set it on her work table. Then she walked out to the back of her shop where Clara was pinning a hem and said, "Clara, can you manage the afternoon?" Clara looked up. She had known Margaret for 11 years at this point and could read her as well as most people read the weather. "Good news or strange news?" "Both," Margaret said. "I need to go see Oliver." She rode out to the Arrow Ranch and found him at the south barn, going over the fall inventory with Hector, and she showed him the letter. He read it with the careful attention he gave everything. He looked up. "Is this enough?" he asked. He meant, "Is this what you deserved, or is this a consolation for something they should have given you fully?" She thought about this honestly, as she thought about everything. "It is not everything it should be," she said. "The law will change eventually, and women will sit the bar, and this letter will seem like a small and half-hearted precursor to that. But in the present tense, in what I can actually do with it, yes, it is something real." He handed the letter back. "Then it is something to be proud of." "It is something to be proud of," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. 11 years since he had walked into her shop with a bundle of shirts. 11 years of Fridays and Sunday mornings, and the case against Western consolidated, and the rusted safe and September vows and 3 children and the paper in the journal and the symposium in Lawrence and the informal instruction sessions in her back room and every conversation in between. "Margaret," he said. "Oliver," she said. "I find," he said, "that every year I know more about what you are, and every year the total is larger than the year before." She gave him that rare, complete smile. "Is that a complaint?" "It is," he said, "the finest possible thing." Hector, who was standing nearby and had heard all of this while appearing to be absorbed in the inventory ledger, decided that this would be a good moment to walk to the other side of the barn and allow the two of them whatever privacy married people needed in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The rest of the 1890s moved with the particular pace of a life that has found its rhythm, not without difficulty, because the Kansas plains offered no existence without difficulty, but with the kind of grounded momentum that comes from knowing who you are and who you are with and what you are building. Arthur grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who at 9 was already showing his mother's precision and his father's practicality in a combination that made Hector shake his head and say they were in trouble when that one was grown. Eleanor was fierce and funny, and had inherited Oliver's directness and Margaret's sharpness, and applied both simultaneously in ways that made her irresistible and occasionally exhausting. James was the wild card, joyful, physical, interested in everything, unwilling to be categorized, and possessed of a laugh that could be heard across the ranch yard. Margaret's shop remained the center of her professional life, though the informal instruction sessions had grown to the point where she had established a regular Tuesday evening schedule with 12 regular attendees and occasional visitors. Clara, who had been with her since the beginning, had become a seamstress of considerable skill in her own right, and Margaret had begun encouraging her toward formal instruction, writing letters to the Lawrence Normal School on her behalf. Oliver's Ranch was one of the successful cattle operations in their county by the mid-1890s, not the largest, but among the most consistently sound. He had a reputation for fair dealing and for paying his hands well, which meant he kept good people, and good people, over time, produce good results. Hector Vasquez, who was past 60 now and had slowed somewhat at the physical work, had moved into a role that was more supervisory than manual, and had been joined on the ranch by his nephew Eduardo, who was 25 and an excellent horseman. In the summer of 1897, Oliver and Margaret took the children to Kansas City for a week. It was the first real journey they had made as a family, and it was partly logistical. Oliver had business with a cattle buyer, and Margaret had agreed to speak at a women's educational symposium, and partly something they had decided they wanted to do together, to take their children somewhere larger than what they had always known and let them see more of the world. Arthur, 12, who had inherited his mother's observational habit, took notes in a small notebook that Margaret had given him for the purpose. Eleanor, 10, who was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, negotiated the streets of Kansas City with the confidence of someone twice her age. James, 6, was transfixed by the trolley cars and talked about them continuously and with enormous feeling. Margaret and Oliver, walking through the streets of Kansas City on their last evening there, the children temporarily in the care of a hotel maid who had been charmed into the arrangement by Eleanor, were quiet together in the way they were always quiet together, not emptily but fully, two people who had found that silence was another country they inhabited comfortably. "Are you happy?" Oliver asked. He asked it periodically, not anxiously, but with the genuine curiosity of a man who considered the question important to keep current. "Comprehensively," she said. "You?" "More than I know how to say," he said, "which is a problem I have had consistently since about the second time I walked into your shop." She laughed. "You managed." "I usually do," he said, "when it matters." She took his arm, and they walked through the evening streets of Kansas City, and somewhere behind them James was possibly talking about trolley cars in his sleep, and Eleanor was probably negotiating something, and Arthur was taking notes on things none of them would know about until he read them aloud on the stage home, and Oliver and Margaret Archer walked in the lamplight of a city in the closing years of a century, and in the middle of a life that was exactly what both of them had chosen. In the spring of 1900, when the new century was young and the world was in the process of becoming something larger and faster than it had been, Caldwell Creek held a celebration for its 30th anniversary as an incorporated town. There was a parade and a speech by the mayor, and a considerable quantity of the same kind of spontaneous food and music that had marked the celebration 17 years earlier when Victor Haas had been put on a stage to Wichita, and the town had breathed free. Margaret was asked to speak. She had been asked before, at various events, and had generally found ways to redirect the invitation toward someone else. She was not, by preference, a woman who sought the front of a room when the front of a room was ceremonial rather than practical. But this time she accepted, because the mayor was specific about what he was asking. He wanted the town's history told by someone who had been present for the part of it that mattered most. She spoke for 15 minutes, standing in the street outside the Meridian where a platform had been built, in the bright May morning, with Oliver in the front row beside their children Arthur, 15 and nearly his father's height, Eleanor, 13, who listened with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing it for future use, James, 9, who was sitting still with the concentrated effort of someone for whom sitting still was a full project. She told the town's story clearly and without unnecessary drama, which was very much her way. She talked about the land, and the people who had worked it, and the winter that had been hard and the seasons that had been generous. She talked about the case against Western Consolidated without specifically naming Victor Haas, because he had been convicted of fraud in Wichita and had served his time, and she saw no purpose in the naming at this late date. She talked about what the documents in the safe had meant, and why they had mattered, and what they represented. And then she said, "This town has survived because of the work of people who were not willing to let it not survive." That is the simplest possible description of what community is. People deciding that the collective good is worth their individual effort. I am grateful to have been one of those people, and I am grateful to this town for giving me a place to be fully what I am. She stepped down from the platform to the kind of applause that means something. Oliver was beside her in an instant, and he put his arm around her without caring who was watching, which at this point was everyone, and he said quietly into her hair, "That was exactly right." "It was true," she said, which was her highest standard. "That is usually why things are right," he said. Arthur, standing beside them, was writing something in his notebook, which he had been keeping continuously since the Kansas City trip 3 years earlier, and had recently confided to his mother that he intended to be a journalist, a plan she found excellent. Eleanor had already engaged 3 separate adults in conversation about points Margaret had made in her speech that she wanted to understand more fully. James had found Pete Dolly's son, who was his exact age and his best friend, and they had disappeared in the direction of what was probably something their parents would hear about later. The celebration continued through the afternoon and into the evening, and Caldwell Creek in the new century looked and felt like a town that had earned its existence and intended to continue it. That evening, late, after the children were asleep and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Oliver and Margaret sat on the porch as they had sat on many hundreds of evenings over the 17 years of their marriage. The stars were out in the specific, extravagant way they came out on the Kansas plains, unmediated by city light, just the dark sky and the enormous profusion of them. "I have been thinking," Margaret said, "about what comes next." Oliver looked at her. "In what sense?" "Arthur will go east for school in a few years if he chooses to, and he should, and we should help him. Eleanor will need, in time, more than what the Caldwell Creek schoolhouse can offer, and there is a girls' school in Lawrence that I have been writing to about. James is 9 and already uncontainable, and I think we should let him be uncontainable in the direction of something specific before he finds his own direction, which knowing him will be spectacular and possibly alarming. She was quiet for a moment. The shop is in good hands with Clara if I want to change what I spend my time on. He was watching her. What do you want to spend it on? She looked at the stars. There is a woman in Topeka who is starting a legal aid office for property owners who cannot afford representation. She has written to me twice about whether I would be willing to consult. She paused. And Professor Wright has asked whether I would consider a formal teaching position in Lawrence part-time on applied chemistry. Oliver was quiet. I am not asking permission, she said into his silence. I want your thoughts. My thoughts, he said, are that you should do both if you want to. My thoughts are that this ranch and this family will still be here, and Hector and Eduardo between them can manage what I need managing when I am away, and you should not be smaller than you are. He turned to look at her directly. I said this at the beginning, Margaret. I said it before I knew you half as well as I know you now, and I mean it twice as strongly. You are not a limitation. You are not a liability. You are the most capable person I have ever known, and anything that lets you use more of that is something I want for you. She looked at him. After 17 years, she could still sometimes be surprised by the exact shape of him, the way the thing she had known she loved turned and showed her another face of itself that she had not quite seen before. Oliver, she said. Margaret. I chose correctly, she said. I want you to know that I know that. In the same way I know other things I've calculated and confirmed. I am certain. He reached over and took her hand. So am I, he said. I have been certain since a July afternoon when a seamstress told me that whoever sewed my jacket originally hadn't accounted for the way I carry. She laughed softly. It was obvious. Everything about you was obvious, he said. I just needed to pay attention. They sat in the night together, and the stars were overhead, and the Arrow Ranch was around them, and Caldwell Creek was 5 miles west, and the century ahead of them was wide open, and full of everything that good lives fill themselves with difficulty and joy and work, and children growing and seasons turning, and the continuous discovery of a person who keeps being larger and more complex and more essential than you had yet understood. Later, when they went inside, Oliver paused at the door and looked back at the stars for a moment, and Margaret paused with him. What is it? She asked. Nothing, he said. Everything. He looked at her, just aware of it. She understood. She was aware of it too, the specific weight and texture of a life that was exactly what you had wanted and exactly what you had worked for, and exactly what you had chosen. Not perfect, never perfect, but true. True in the way that things compounded carefully from the right ingredients were true, reliable, structural sound. She took his hand, and they went inside, into the warm interior of the house full of their sleeping children, and the evidence of their days, and the accumulated particular history of two people who had found each other in a small Kansas town, and decided, with the full force of their considerable respective intelligences, that what they were building together was worth every single thing they had put into it. And outside on the plains, the night was quiet and the stars were very bright, and the Arrow Ranch stood in the dark like something permanent, which it was, which they had made it, which they would continue to make it, because that was what they did together, and with their eyes open, and with their whole hearts, for as long as the Kansas plains had mornings and the safe in the sheriff's office had a key that turned, and a seamstress in a narrow storefront between the general store and the post office had a formula for every problem that the world could set in front of her, and a man with gray eyes knew how to pay attention to the right things, which, it turned out, made all the difference.